So a little a little earlier this morning, I did an equipment check with Tim, and he told me that Patrick was going to be stepping down as the chairman of the TBC, and I was made me think a little bit about Patrick's service and things that he's done over the years involved with the TBC. I'm sure he'll continue to contribute. But he's done a lot in the last several years, and he's been my personal attendant whenever I came out there. So I have a warm place in my heart for Patrick because of that. And I was thinking about this principle that Patrick's service reminds me of, and it's a principle of generosity. The Buddha talks about generosity quite a bit. It's one of the aspects of what he called the gradual training. When we come to Buddhism, we often we're looking for some way out of suffering. We're looking for enlightenment. We're looking for nibbana or nirvana. Or we may have all kinds of ideas about what that means. And the Buddha says, yes, you can develop this. This is something that you can experience. But it's not an all or nothing affair. For a long time, there's been this debate in various schools of Buddhism about whether enlightenment is something which happens gradually or something which happens suddenly. So there's these two different schools, you could say, in the different traditions. The sudden enlightenment school, where you kind of just sit and meditate for a long time, and then one day some kind of light bulb goes off and you wake up finally. That sounds pretty good. But there's the other school which is asserting that no, it's very gradually. Awakening happens over a long period of time. And when you study what the Buddha taught, it's clear that he had something of a hybrid teaching. It's not completely one or the other. The gradual training works by slowly transforming one's view and inner experience of the world. And it's very human, very doable, very, in many ways, seemingly ordinary. And it doesn't necessarily involve that much sitting in meditation, at least not at first. But as the gradual training progresses, the mind becomes more and more able to benefit from meditation. And then at a certain point, enlightenment does dawn. And that's when it becomes sort of sudden. But what dawns is not a radically different point of view. What it's more like a consolidation of the point of view that's been developing all along because of the gradual training. And so just to put it in context, the gradual training, the way the Buddha put it is, he kind of put it in two different ways. Way number one is what you do and the experiences that you have along the way. So he says the gradual training begins with generosity. So by cultivating generosity, so generosity in obviously the most public expression of generosity is often some form of giving. So giving food, giving shelter, giving clothing. And this is a much honored and much practiced form of generosity that we find throughout Buddhist cultures. And also in Western culture, generosity is well respected in Western cultures as well. But generosity is a little bigger than that, actually, in Buddhism. So it's more like a generosity of heart that we're cultivating, a willingness to serve others. And there's all kinds of ways that we can do that. Obviously, one way is to participate in a community effort like the TBC and make a contribution, take up some of the responsibilities and service, provide some service to other people. So that's step number one of this gradual training. And along very shortly on the heels of generosity, by practicing generosity, we teach ourselves a little bit about what it means to let go, to give, to sort of open the hand and give rather than reach into the world and take. What we experience when we practice generosity is a different kind of happiness. The Buddha points out that the world, for the most part, depends on sensual contact for happiness. We're looking for happiness in the form of sensual gratification and possessions and experiences and relationships. And all those things do actually bring a kind of happiness. But the problem with them is that they're somewhat unreliable, and they depend on external conditions. Whereas when one practices generosity, the happiness one experiences is of a more subtle, but in many ways superior sort. So you can imagine someone who's spent a couple of years putting a few hours every week into keeping a Buddhist sitting group going, making arrangements, inviting teachers, setting up venues, helping with registration, all the things that have to be done. When that person's looking back on their conduct later on in their life, maybe on their deathbed, they're looking back and they're thinking about all that time and effort they put into that action, that spirit of generosity that's there. When they look back on that, they'll see that what they were doing was admirable and worthy, and it will make them feel good. They'll feel a sense of heart uplift. And this is the happiness that the Buddha is talking about. We actually feel good about ourselves. We feel good in a kind of a needless way. We don't need anything to come to us in order to have this good feeling. So this is a happiness that's really only depends on us having done and conducted ourselves in a generous way. When we look back on that generous conduct, we'll always feel good. It'll always give us a sense of worthiness and nobility and kind of an ebullience in the heart that's very subtle compared to the gratification happiness that we get when we indulge in any kind of sensual pleasures. So the Buddha creates a contrast between this worldly happiness of, he uses sensual pleasures as a kind of a placeholder for all forms of worldly happiness. But whenever we're looking at the world to give us happiness by giving us things from the world, whether it's relationships or possessions or experiences, he points out that kind of happiness, in contrast, is very dependent and very often leaves us hungry for more. If we have a good experience with a food, for example, we go to a nice restaurant, we have a wonderful meal, there's a lot of pleasure in that. And then when the meal's over, that pleasure is gone. We only have the memory of it. And maybe the next day we want to have that same pleasure again. So the sensual pleasures don't have any abilities to sustain themselves over time. Whereas the pleasure and the happiness of generous conduct is always there as a refuge. You can always look back on your generous conduct at any moment in time, and it will always uplift your mind when you contemplate it. So it's accessible and available all the time. If you train yourself in generosity thoroughly, then eventually you create a habit of generosity in your mind, and whenever any event unfolds in your life, there's a traffic jam or there's some kind of a crush at the shopping mall, or it's time to get up early, because your heart's trained in generosity, you'll always be looking at your actions in terms of how can I give to this situation? How can I contribute in a way that will help make others happy? So rather than looking at what's bad about the situation, it's easier to look at a situation to see what the opportunities are for expressing generosity. And it's because having trained your heart, when there's a traffic jam, someone's trying to get on the ramp to the freeway, Generosity says, oh, let's make some room for this person without creating trouble for other people. Whereas greed says, no, don't let them on. I want the freeway for myself. Right? So generosity is always looking at a situation in terms of what can be given, because it knows through experience that that will lead to a sense of ease and happiness in the heart. Whereas greed is looking for gratification in the present moment. It's not thinking about the future so much. So this is a principle that we get trained in by practicing generosity. We train ourselves in what it means to substitute a higher happiness for a lesser happiness. We learn how to become less embroiled in the happinesses of the world, and more attuned to the Buddha's version of happiness, which is grounded in generosity. When we practice generosity and we start to see the truth of this, we might be then inclined to continue with the gradual training, which takes us next to practicing virtue. So virtue, of course, is traditionally said to be started with the 5 precepts. So we take the precepts, and these are precepts against taking life, taking what's not given, any kind of thieving, any kind of theft, any kind of harsh or, sexual misconduct, any kind of harsh or false speech, and finally, refraining from intoxicants. And each one of these 5 precepts, the 5 precepts form the basis for all what in Buddhism is understood to be virtue. So the 5 precepts are the basis of you may have heard of the 8 precepts and the 10 precepts. These are precepts that people in monasteries. So 8 precepts are, and then monks take 227 precepts, and nuns, I think, take 330 precepts. So there's more precepts if you want, but every one of those other systems of precepts is based, founded upon the 5 precepts. So they just elaborate those 5 precepts a little more detail. But the 5 precepts are the core of virtue in Buddhism, and what they point to is various forms of what's called restraint. So we hold ourselves back from doing things which are unskillful. When we take the precepts, they kind of sensitize our mind to the mind's natural inclination to do things which maybe aren't so useful. So we become more reluctant to say something that's self-serving and not necessarily true. So rather than just sort of using speech to get what we want, to protect ourselves, to build ourselves up in the eyes of others, for all kinds of personal purposes, we start using our speech primarily to express truth and utility to the world. Another way of expressing generosity, you could say, using speech for generosity. And then other than that, we learn to be quiet. So we restrain ourselves. We restrain ourselves in terms of speech, in terms of sexuality, in terms of the objects of the world. And by doing that, we're sort of, again, we're training ourselves to let go, to stand a little bit back from what the world has on offer, or seems to have on offer. And again, we get to experience this more refined kind of happiness that the Buddha is pointing to. So again, if you really take any one of these precepts seriously and practice it fully, it goes beyond merely not killing. For example, the first precept against taking life. When you start to become very sensitive to the life of other beings, your other fellow human beings, fellow animals, all creatures, not only do you take care not to kill them, but you also take care not to bring them any harm. And harm, it has a big spectrum. So, one time you might have felt it was okay to throw a rock at a dog, and later on it might seem that that's unworthy. Even if the dog is doing something annoying, it might seem like it's not proper to do anything that might harm the dog, even if you still need to do something to protect your property. So what we're confronted with when we take on these virtues is we're confronted with a series of very ordinary moral dilemmas. There'll be an impulse to do something like use speech harshly, to say something mean or nasty because we feel offended or because we feel hurt. And if we're taking the precepts seriously, there'll also be an impulse alongside that to not violate the precept. And so we'll have this little dilemma that we have to resolve in our minds in real time when the opportunities present themselves. So we start becoming more attuned again to how the world is challenging our precepts, how well we're doing with our precepts, along with, of course, continuing to express generosity in the world. And it turns out that generosity and virtue are really, they're kind of the same thing. Right? Precepts are kind of a gift to the world. By restraining ourselves, we make the world a little bit safer place for everybody else. So it's a gift that we give to the world. And it has more or less the same effect on the heart. If we look back on our conduct, and we see that our conduct is largely in line with what the precepts are pointing to, what we've signed up for, it feels good. Right? We don't have any sense of regret or remorse or wishing that we had done it differently. And our mind gets more and more at ease with letting go of what we want, what we think is going to make us happy by grabbing onto. And we're training ourselves in this principle of letting go, letting go, letting go. So there's a reason for this training. It's not just to make the world a nicer place. That's a very, very good additional effect. But ultimately, it's to train our own hearts in this core principle of the Buddha's teachings, which is that suffering is caused by grasping. And in order to experience the happiness of the end of suffering, we have to train ourselves in this principle of non-grasping, of letting go. So generosity and virtue are both modes of training that the Buddha starts us off with, and which we never finish. We never, even the Buddha himself never stopped practicing generosity. He never stopped practicing virtue. So as practitioners, this is the core and the foundation of our practices. If we never did anything else other than generosity and virtue, but we did it out of faith in the Buddha's teaching, we could reckon ourselves as disciples of the Buddha. We were taking his teaching seriously and we're putting it into practice. And the Buddha points out that when you do this, you experience the happiness of letting go over and over again throughout your life. And this happiness, if you were to pass away before tasting enlightenment, you would be reborn in heaven. So, and actually that's a strategic goal for a lot of people who are practicing in other parts of the world, is to conduct themselves virtuously so that they can get born in heaven, because that's what they want. They want to be born in heaven. The Buddha doesn't condemn that, but he points out that there's yet another higher happiness even than that. Because getting reborn in heaven, as great as it might be, it doesn't last forever. So ultimately that comes to an end as well. And then one finds himself back on the path practicing again. So the happiness of these kinds of conduct and the results that they bring, a practitioner eventually sees that even that is not the ultimate happiness that the Buddha has to offer. And this brings us to the next phases of the path, the gradual training, which includes renunciation. So doing things like giving up entertainment and beautification and adornment, which is one of the higher precepts, and using the time and the energy that's been freed up by that, arranging our lives to do things like go on meditation retreat, to engage even more fully with the teaching and with the practice. So renunciation means, in effect, seeing through the happinesses of the world and turning away from them, even the happiness of heaven itself, because of its temporariness. and setting your heart on final liberation. When the heart goes in that direction, we study the Dhamma much more deeply, and we come to understand the Four Noble Truths for ourselves in a direct way. Not in an intellectual way, not in a scholarly way, but in a direct, experiential, deep in the heart way, where we know exactly what the Buddha is talking about. And we get to experience the nature of suffering and understand it. We get to see how clinging causes suffering, and how that clinging has to be abandoned. We get to experience the abandoning of that clinging, and we get to experience the cessation of suffering that comes as a result of abandoning clinging. So this is the Buddha's path of gradual awakening. When we finally abandon clinging, then we experience what's called gnosis or enlightenment or awakening, that the Buddha is pointing, and sometimes called enlightenment in the West, Nibbana. Nibbana is an interesting word. It means cooling or going out, like a flame that's been, some fire that's been burning, and a fire finally goes out and it cools off. So the grasping of the mind at the things of the world in order to get happiness and satisfaction cools off. And what's left is a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on external conditions. So this gradual training is a principle that's worth bearing in mind. It's also expressed as the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the fourth noble truth of the Four Noble Truth. So right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood. You can see that virtue and generosity are built right in to the Eightfold Noble Path. Then finally, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So those are the ones that we tend to think of when we think of what the Buddha taught, or what we think of Buddhism as sitting in meditation. And it's important to bear in mind that what the Buddha taught was he had those items, the right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness, right concentration, those three that we associate with meditation. He had those at the end of the path. So that's the part that we develop after having set the stage, after having created the foundation of generosity, virtue, and renunciation. When we have those well developed, then the effort and the mindfulness and the concentration that it takes to really develop meditation becomes more or less natural, more or less easy and accessible. So if you find yourself trying to practice meditation and feeling like you're stuck in a rut, or you're at a plateau, things aren't really changing, you're starting to wonder whether the Buddhist teachings are really true, it's worth looking at your practice and asking yourself, is there more you could be doing in terms of generosity, virtue, and renunciation? Because those actually come first. They're foundational. And furthermore, we never really get done with those ones. So the Buddha, to the very end of his life, was practicing generosity, virtue, and renunciation. His very last act was to offer the generosity of encouragement, encouraging the monks to go fulfill their practice, to go meditate, and to realize enlightenment for themselves. So that example, and the example of our fellow practitioners, like the example of Patrick, can inspire us to bring these principles even more fully to life in our own practice, so that we can taste this happiness for ourselves and come to know it more deeply. When we're happy and our heart is content, meditation becomes easier. If we're trying to get something out of meditation, we're trying to make our meditation make us happy, then we're kind of approaching it from the wrong direction, and it doesn't work so well. So those are some thoughts for this morning. It's about 1:45, I think. And let me invite you. I've got a few minutes left. I just heard the meal bell. So now I have 15 minutes to kill before I have to be there to receive the meal. So I invite if anybody has any questions they'd like to bring up, It doesn't necessarily have to be about what I talked about, but anything that you'd like to ask. Yeah, please go ahead about that. That's a very important one. When I was living in California, I knew a lot of Buddhists who thought the first 4 precepts made a lot of sense, but the fifth precept was like going too far. They would only they'd sort of take it half seriously and only maybe like not drink to excess, or only drink on the weekends, right? And we used to call it the 4.5 precepts. So when you're thinking about precepts, one thing to keep bearing in mind is the Buddha's teaching on kamma. So kamma is a word which means action. But the Buddha says, when I say kamma, I don't mean action, I mean intention. So what's your intention when you're engaging in any kind of an act has more bearing on that act than the actual act itself or the outcome of that act. So if you're using any kind of a drug for a therapeutic purpose, such as pain relief or relief of some other symptom, then the intention there isn't necessarily one to cause dullness, to escape for the sake of entertainment, right? Because you know that people can do that with hallucinogens, right? They can use psilocybin or DMT or anything else for kind of fun, right? So fun in order to get high for the buzz. Any drug can be any mind-altering drug can be used like that as a way of not coming to understand the world more deeply, but rather simply to escape the world, to change the world in a way that's entertaining. So if I would say that the traditions that use ayahuasca in a kind of a religious or a spiritual modality, and they've worked out techniques that allow the practitioners to come to understand themselves and the world more deeply, especially insofar as that leads the practitioner in the direction of the practices of generosity and virtue and renunciation. It wouldn't fall as a violation of the 5th precept. The 5th precept, taking those 5 precepts, were to feel that by ingesting this substance, I am transgressing against the 5th precept, then they should not do it. I mean, they should reconsider that, because again, it's the intention that counts. So it's a little bit, I had a discussion similar to this about vegetarianism. So the Buddha was pretty clear that it's okay for the monks to eat whatever's offered. And if what gets offered to us includes meat, then we're okay to eat the meat. But if you're convinced that eating meat is somehow visiting violence, is causing harm, then for a person who's got that conviction, they would have to intentionally decide to cause harm. They would choose, if seeing that it's harmful, they would have to choose to do harm if they were going to eat meat. So persons who in their mind come to this conviction that any sort of an action causes harm, out of a principle of harmlessness, they don't want to do it, then they probably should stick with that, because the intention is the critical thing. You could sort of see that it's possible to come to a similar conclusion about things like consumerism, not using public transport. You could make any one of these things in your mind, a harm-causing activity, and then if you really believe that, then it would be not good for you spiritually to intentionally go against that perception. So perception of harm is a very important part of understanding this principle of kamma. If we don't perceive that we're doing some harm, then, and we're not intending to do harm, then you could say our conscience can be clear. Even though maybe our actions are unwittingly causing some kind of harm. That's always the case. You walk across the carpet and you step on some small insect. The action and the harm to the insect are happening, but it's not your intention. And so it doesn't have anything to do with your spiritual development. So that's kind of the big principle there. Intention, and primarily the fifth precept has to do with the intention to alter consciousness for escape and recreation purposes. All right, so it's another form of renunciation. Yes, I haven't raised any children myself, but I've been uncle to quite a few, and have a little bit of a sense of what you're going through. One thing is to hold it very lightly, right? It's a developmental process. Children, you actually need children to take things about their body pretty seriously. Like you need, at a certain point, you have to sort of teach your child that the body is their responsibility so that they'll take care of it. And at a certain point later on in their development, they have to learn, if they're going to be practitioners, they learn that the body is not self. But before you can really get there, you have to actually believe that the body is self. So this is a process that we go through where we first grab onto the body as this is me, and we learn to defend it, and we become concerned about its welfare. But later on as practitioners, we get to see that, oh, the body's not really me, it's just something that I'm grasping onto, and there's a downside to that grasping. So, but you have to walk before you can run. It's quite natural for children that age to want things, to grasp at things. Certainly they're seeing their peers do that. As a parent, one thing you can do to counteract it is to simply model what you think is a good practice of generosity. Like, I don't know, you could take them with you to a soup kitchen and put food in people's bowls, and just have them go through the actual physical motions of giving things to other people, and then ask them later how it felt. Right? So that those kind of little experiences do a lot more than any kind of lectures could do about the benefits of this or that. It has to be, for children, it has to be really experiential. Right? They can't really understand words. All they hear is ga 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 ga. You can't have what you want. Right? So you need to sort of connect with their heart somehow in a way that makes sense to them. So I hope that helps. Okay, one more quick question. Yeah.
My name's sorry, I forgot to.
Yeah, it's kind of a big topic, but I'll give you a thumbnail sketch. At the time of the Buddha, it was widely considered to be true and understood by most people that the way our existence as beings works is that we're born here in this human realm, and when we pass away, there will be some sort of existence hereafter. For most people, maybe that existence is another round in the human realm. But for some will go to a better, a higher realm called the celestial realms. And these realms are occupied not by humans, but by what are called celestial beings or devas. And there's a whole cosmology that involves devas going all the way up to the Brahma realms. And these realms of the devas correspond with the jhanas, the eight forms of meditative concentration called the jhanas. So jhanas 1 through 8, there's 8 heavens that go along with it. Now, it's not possible to objectively verify this in any sort of scientific way, so far as I know. But it's widely believed by many people. And correspondingly, there's also lower realms where the mind will take rebirth if one conducts oneself badly. So this is just another manifestation of cause and effect. That's the way it's understood. Later tradition developed this theory of the future Buddha Maitreya living in a particular heavenly realm called the Pure Land. And that's a form of Buddhism that involved basically faith alone. Not necessarily all these other things that I've been talking about, including the Four Noble Truths, but just faith alone. So Pure Land Buddhism has a particular historical reason why it developed, a social reason why it developed. Certainly its pretty far away on the spectrum from Theravada Buddhism. But the great thing about Pure Land Buddhists is that they're really sweet. So you can also think of it more in sort of psychological terms. If you find yourself full of misery and despair as a human being, you're kind of living in a hell realm. If you find yourself having practiced generosity and virtue, constantly having a sense of lightness and ease and everything is okay, and seeing the world in terms of the opportunities for expressing goodness, even hell can be right here in the heart. It doesn't necessarily have to be just in life after this one. So, but even in this very life, when we experience feelings of heaven, this lightness and this happiness, it's possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end, that we're finished. We can relax. The Buddha encourages us to keep practicing until we get to renunciation and the Four Noble Truths and actual enlightenment. And that's a happiness that goes even beyond heaven in his dispensation. Thank you so much. May you all be well. And maybe see each other again soon. I'll maybe see you in the spring after the winter retreat. Okay, bye-bye.